Well, it's great to have all of you with us today. My name is Chris, and we're in this series based off a book written by Andy Stanley titled Better Decisions, Fewer Regrets. And here's what we all know, that good questions lead to good decisions. So throughout the series, we're focusing in on a series of good questions. Last week, Mike focused in on the integrity question, and this week, Bevan Bish, our DuBois pastor, is focusing in on the legacy question. And I absolutely love that Bevan gets this question. So when Bevan comes up here in a few moments, why don't you give him a warm TCC welcome?
Well, hey everyone, my name is Bevan. I'm the campus pastor at TCC DuBois, and I'm so excited that I get to share part 3 of our series, Better Decisions, Fewer Regrets. And so all throughout this series, we're going to be looking at some questions that are going to help guide our decisions and hopefully help us make better ones. Because what we know is that when we ask good questions, we make better decisions, and when we make better decisions, we end up with fewer regrets. So if you were with us for part 1, you remember that Dan left us with a key verse in the book of Proverbs. And in Proverbs 27:12, it says this: "The prudent see danger and take refuge, but the simple keep going and pay the penalty." So ultimately, what this means is that people that are prudent or wise, they look ahead to the future to see what's coming. And if there's anything that they need to do to course correct, to avoid danger, they do so. But other people that maybe live more day by day or in the moment don't see what's coming ahead because they're so focused on the right here and now. And ultimately, that leads to consequences. And so last week, Mike shared with us the first question that we needed to ask ourselves. It's called the integrity question. And the integrity question is this: am I being honest with myself, really? And you see, we had to add really to the end of this question so we could get serious with ourselves, so we could truly be honest. And the reason this question is so important to ask is because the person in the mirror, you and me, is the easiest person to deceive. And you know that. We're the easiest person to sell or convince on our bad decisions. And so we have to ask ourselves with brutal honesty if we're truly being real, if we're truly being honest with ourselves. Even if it makes us feel bad, even if it leaves us with mixed emotions, we have to be honest with ourselves. Because if we don't, we'll never ask ourselves this question and do something about it. And so this week, we're going to be talking about something called the legacy question. But before we get into the legacy question, I just want to talk about this word right here: story. Everybody has a story. In fact, right now, you're living out your story. And whether you realize it or not, you make up your story one decision at a time. Every circumstance you're faced with, every situation you are in, and every decision you make tells the story of your life. And story is something that we see all the time. You see, one of the ways we see story is through history. You read a history book, you can see what happened in generations before. You can see the mistakes that were made and hopefully avoid them. Or you can look at what was done really well and expand on that and do more of it. Another way that we see story come up in our everyday life is entertainment. We watch movies, we listen to podcasts, and everything that we listen to or watch is telling a story. We all have our favorite TV show, and we follow the story like it's the end of the world. We want to see what happens to those characters, and we want to see what happens overall in that plot line. And so we have entertainment, and then lastly, we have literature. Books, novels, articles, all these things tell stories of characters, of key events, and again, they're ways that we interact with story in our everyday lives. We also love to hear a good story, don't we? We all have those stories that we love hearing. Maybe for you, you asked your grandparents what it was like growing up when they were a kid. And you just loved hearing the stories of how everything was so different and how they even survived without the internet or Google. Or maybe you loved hearing the story of your parents, how they got together, how they met, how they fell in love, and ultimately, how you came into the picture. And we all have that one family story that we love to tell. Comes up at family reunions, family vacations, and usually has us on the floor laughing. We all love hearing a good story. Well, lastly, love stories. Whether we want to admit it or not, guys, we love stories. We love when two people find each other in the end. And so I know you've all been there, right? You're with your girlfriend or you're with your wife, and they put on a rom-com, and you're like, okay, here we go. And you roll your eyes, but by minute 45, you're totally invested, and you're just like hanging on to the end of your seat because you want to find out what happens with these two people. I know this is me. I love a good love story. And so a person I think has a great love story is a guy named Jeremy Roloff. So he wrote a book, it's called A Love Letter Life. And if you don't know who Jeremy Roloff is, he's a guy that grew up on television, which is unusual for most people. But his family was on a show called Little People, Big World. And it kind of just showcased their family all through the years. And so he was on this show. And the cool thing is that his story is being told through this show. His love story is being told of how he met his wife and how they fell in love and how they got married. And so him and his wife, Audrey, they wrote this book called A Love Letter Life. And in it, they just give practical advice on how to tell a great love story, how to tell a great love story with your life and with your relationship. And so whenever they came to key moments in their life and in their story, they asked themselves this question: is this the love story that I want to tell? And I think it's an important question to ask, whether it's in a romantic relationship or just a friendship. Is this the story that you want to tell? And when you ask that question, I think it's going to lead to making better decisions. So some stories live forever. Some people call them legacies. Other people might call them legends. But what is a legacy? Like, what is a legacy really? And so I looked it up, and a simple definition of legacy on the dictionary is an amount of money or property left to someone in a will. Now, I don't know about you, but that's like a boring definition of legacy for me. I don't think of that when I think of legacy. I think that's more of like the definition for inheritance. When I think of legacy, I think of a father who instills his values and his beliefs and a way to live into the lives of his kids. And then those kids grow up and they live out exactly what their father taught them. Maybe it's living a generous life. Maybe it's being kind to everyone, no matter who they are. But that's what I think of when I think of legacy. I think of a family passing on their values from generation to generation. Or I think of teachers, the way they inspire students to learn, to get creative, to be passionate about certain subjects, and how that goes on with those students all throughout their life, ultimately leading them to a career or a life that they love. These teachers are instilling their legacy in the way that they teach their students to have a passion for learning. You know, it also makes me think of significant leaders that made an impact. People like Martin Luther King Jr., or Mother Teresa, or Gandhi. And I think the person with the greatest legacy is Jesus. Well, John Maxwell was a guy that wrote a book called 21 Irrefutable Laws of Leadership. If you have ever experienced anything in leadership, I'm sure you know who John Maxwell is. When I was early in my leadership, I picked up his book, I read through it, and I actually read through it again because it's just full of golden nuggets when it comes to leading people and just having relationships with others. And so he has this law in his book called The Law of Legacy. And at the end of the chapter, he kind of gives this one quotation that I think sums up so well what legacy really is and how we can confuse it for other things. And so he says this: achievement is when you can do great things by yourself. People that achieve things are go-getters. They see goals, they set goals, and then they smash goals. They're just the kind of person that's driven, that's ready to go, and that works all hours of the day to achieve what they want. They do that because they have this inner drive. Success comes when you empower employees to do great things for you. So maybe you just became a boss, or maybe you're leading a group of people, and now you have other people that can do things with you and for you. And so success comes when you can get people, empower your employees to do things for you that serve the mission that you're looking to reach. And next, we have significance. Significance comes from developing leaders to do great things with you. This is when you lead a team. This is when you and your team brainstorm together to go after the mission that you've been given. And significance happens because your efforts make an impact. It makes a difference. But all that is not legacy. This is what legacy really is. Legacy comes when you put leaders in a position to do great things without you. Long after you're gone, long after your story's been told, you leave a group of people so passionate, so on fire for the mission that they continue to do it even without your presence. That's what legacy really is. Well, whether we realize it or not, we're obsessed with legacy. You see, we have sites like Ancestry.com or 23andMe, where we literally pay companies, go on websites to find out where we came from, to see what future generations will look like, and to see what past generations look like in our family. We're fascinated by where we came from and those who came before us. And we also have tools like a genogram, which is used in therapy and counseling. And it's simply just a tool to help somebody kind of map out their family tree, to look at the significant things that happen in the lives of the people in their family tree. Maybe things like addiction, maybe things like struggle, maybe things like a loss of the family, a divorce, things that made an impact, things that they can see and hopefully work through and heal so that they can move forward in a positive way for future generations. We're obsessed with legacy. And then there's this thought of generational family. You see, in America, a generational family looks like you have some kids who have their parents and then their parents. You have 3 generations. That's a pretty good generational family in America. But believe it or not, there's other cultures that are even more generationally minded. There's people in the world today that can track their generation. They can track their heritage and their genealogy for thousands of generations. They can see who their great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandparents are. Now, I don't know about you, but I don't even know the names of my great-great-great-great-grandparents. But I think it's amazing that they have this view of family that just goes so much further beyond one generation above and one generation below. And the thought process is they want to leave something behind that makes a difference. They don't just want to store up treasures for themselves and their family and their kids. They're building up wealth and treasures for generations to come that they will never know. That long after they're gone, these people will benefit from the hard work of their family members. Now, that's what it really means to be a generational family. And we actually see this in the Bible. If you go to the Gospel of Matthew, he starts off right away by telling the genealogy of Jesus, tracing Jesus' ancestral roots all the way back to the first man ever created, Adam, and ultimately to God who created Adam. You can see this again in Luke 3 when he does the same thing after Jesus is baptized by John the Baptist. He goes through all of Jesus' ancestors, leading the whole way back to Adam, who was made by God. This thought of generational family, this thought of legacy is so important, and it's something that we see so often in our lives. And so the legacy question, we're finally getting there, is what story do you want to tell? What is the story of your life that long after you're gone, you want others to be talking about? And remember, we make the story of our life with every decision. One decision at a time, one response at a time. We tell and create the stories of our lives. And so it's important to tell a good story. So how we do this is we make good decisions, and how we make good decisions is we ask good questions. But there's something that gets in the way of our good decisions. Actually, a few things. So the first thing is this. Complex emotions make it hard to be a good decision maker. Whenever your emotions overshadow everything else in a decision, it can be hard to see the bigger picture. It can be hard to actually get objective about a decision. And I want you to hear this. I'm not saying that you should be completely 100% objective when making a decision. But when you notice that your emotions are taking center stage, it's a time to pay attention. The next thing is the immediate versus the ultimate. Our culture constantly screams instant, 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 now. We want things and we want them now. And so it's easy to get caught up in our decision-making process doing things immediately instead of looking down the road and seeing what's ultimate. You see, it's just like Proverbs 27. The prudent look ahead, see danger, and take action. But the simple just keep living on and they face the consequences. And so sometimes the immediate takes center stage and we don't see what we want in the long run. And that makes it hard to make good decisions. The next one is this, hyper-focus. We get so focused on the outcome that we desire or what we want to happen that we completely miss everything else that's happening. This is kind of like what Mike talked about last week with confirmation bias. Once our mind picks a path that it wants to go, a direction it wants to go, it will look for things to confirm that and only things to confirm that. And so when we're so focused on what we want, we start making poor decisions. And lastly, we have this thing called pressure. We all have stress. We've all faced anxiety when it comes to a decision. Sometimes we have pressure externally from family members, from friends, from coworkers, from bosses. Other times we have internal pressure shaped by our values, our beliefs, and our principles. And then sometimes we just have flat out pressure. Like you have to make a decision now. You can't wait. You can't delay. There's a time crunch. And that causes us to make a poor decision because we're making snap judgments. So all these things get in the way of us making good decisions. And so I thought today we should look at a story of a guy that made great decisions. Maybe we can see it as an example of what we can do when we're faced with hard things in life. And so we're going to talk about a guy named Joseph. Joseph is a guy in the Old Testament. His story can be found in the book of Genesis. We're going to be looking at Genesis 39 and 41. And here's what I'm going to tell you. I'm not going to tell the story of Joseph like I normally would. What I'm going to do is I'm going to paraphrase key moments of his story, and then at certain points, we're going to pause, and we're going to take a deeper look at what's really going on. So we're going to talk about Joseph. First, to know something about Joseph, he's the youngest son of Jacob, and Jacob was also known as Israel. And so the Old Testament really is the story of the nation of Israel, which starts with this guy right here and his descendants. So youngest son of Jacob, and he's also the favorite son of his father. And this isn't something like that's speculation. Like this is flat out, everybody knows this. Even his own siblings, like all his brothers know that he's the favorite one. His parents made him a colorful coat just to mark how much they loved him. So you can imagine his older brothers might have been just a little bit annoyed with their younger brother. And so this is what they do. His brothers are extremely jealous to the point where like they're going to do something about this. They're going to take action. And their first plan is they're going to kill their brother, which is an awful plan, right? Like there's things that you can do before you get to that point when it comes to making a decision, I hope. So they reevaluate, they kind of revise their decision. This is what they do. They sell their brother into slavery. They sell him into slavery because that gets their purpose accomplished. No longer do they have to see their brother, but they also don't have to worry about having his blood on their hands. And so right now, I want to take a moment to pause in this story because this is what they made themselves. Joseph's brothers made themselves liars. So not only did they make a poor decision, not only did they do something terrible to their brother, but now they made themselves liars. Now they made them being liars a part of their story. Because what they told their father is that he must have been attacked by a wild animal and killed. So now their father has no idea that his son's out there somewhere else. He'll never see him again. And his brothers are liars. When you tell a story that makes yourself a liar, that's something that follows you. It follows you throughout the rest of your life, usually followed quickly by regret. And then for every decision that you make, every future circumstance that you face, you bring it with you. And so I highlight that because it's important for us to evaluate in our own stories. When we're making a decision, if we lie, we make ourselves a liar for life. And that is something that's hard to live with. So we have to be so careful when we make our decisions. And that's why it's important to ask this legacy question. Well, let's continue on with the story. So Joseph is sold into slavery, and he ends up working at an Egyptian noble's house, a guy named Potiphar. And so you might be thinking, Joseph's probably really sad and depressed. Like he's away from his family. He's never going to see them again. He's in slavery, which I can't imagine would be great. What's he going to do? He could sulk and be depressed, or he could just do his best. And so that's what he chooses to do. He knows that God's with him, and he says, I'm going to do everything I can to be my best, the best version of myself. And so eventually, he gains the favor of the guy he's working with, and he becomes in charge of the entire household. He becomes in charge of everything that his master owns. And so things are looking pretty good for Joseph. A story that started off a little bit rocky is looking just a little bit better. And then this happens. Potiphar's wife tries to get Joseph to sleep with her. Now, it's important to note, Joseph's a young guy, probably a good-looking guy, and she sees him, and she sees that he's got, power over all these things in his household, and she comes up to him and basically just propositions him, and he has another decision to make. So it's decision time for Joseph. He might have even asked himself the legacy question, what story do I want to tell before he makes his decision, before he does anything? And so there's basically two stories that he can tell. The first story is he can give in to his master's wife, he can do what she's asking, and ultimately, he's going to lose his job because that's not the right thing to do. But more importantly, this is not just a moral issue. This is a life or death issue. So Joseph would have been telling the story of a kid who was sold into slavery by his brothers, gained the favor of his master, did something wrong, committed a crime, and ultimately lost his life for it. And then his legacy's done. His story's over. But there's another story that he can tell, and this is what it looks like. You see, in Genesis 39, he's talking to Potiphar's wife, and he says, with me in charge, my master does not concern himself with anything in the house. Everything he owns, he has entrusted to my care. No one is greater in this house than I am. My master has withheld nothing from me except you, because you are his wife. How then could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God? So this is the story that Joseph chooses to tell. He chooses to do the right thing. And here's what happens. Joseph's story continues. He's thrown into prison because Potiphar's wife accuses him of a crime that he didn't commit. And so now he's in another terrible circumstance placed on him by somebody else's actions, something he couldn't control, something that he didn't put himself there by himself. And so he's thrown into prison. And again, Joseph does the right thing. He works hard, he does his best, and he eventually gains the favor of the warden after many years and becomes in charge of everything in the prison. So here's a young guy that just seems to be a great leader, somebody who just ends up in charge of things no matter how he gets there. And so down the road, something happens. He's called up to Pharaoh to interpret a dream. You see, when he was in prison, there were a couple guys that had dreams that he interpreted correctly. One of those guys worked for the king and remembered it and said to the Pharaoh that this guy Joseph can interpret your dream. This guy Joseph interpreted my dream and it came true. And so it's important to know something about this dream. All the wisest people in the kingdom of Egypt, all the astronomers, all the magicians, sorcerers, and the wise men, they couldn't interpret this dream. They had no idea what it meant. And so Pharaoh's at a loss because he's concerned about the dream that he had. And so I'm going to talk about the interpretation of this dream. If you'd like to read about what the dream is, I encourage you, go to Genesis 40 and 41 and you can read exactly what it is. But this is the interpretation of the dream. First off, Joseph goes into Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and he says, I can't interpret your dream, but my God can. And the reason this is significant is because at this time, Pharaoh considered himself a god. Like in all respects, he thought he was a god. So Joseph's basically saying, okay, you're a god and you can't interpret this dream, but my God can. So it seems like he might be stuck in another hard situation just based off how he approaches this. But he does interpret the dream, and he says he interprets it because God gave him the interpretation. It wasn't by his own ability. And so he interprets the dream, and he says that this is what's going to happen in Egypt. There's going to be 7 years of extreme prosperity. You're going to have so much extra that you will not know what to do with it. And then followed by that 7 years of prosperity, there's going to be 7 years of famine. And the famine's going to be so bad, so severe, that everybody in all the land is going to forget about the prosperity that they had just faced. They won't even remember it. And Egypt will be in danger of starving. And so here's what you need to do. And he lays out a plan of what he needs to do. He interprets the dream correctly because God gave him the ability to do so. And now's the time to see what Pharaoh does and what his response to Joseph is. And so he says this. In Genesis 41, so Pharaoh asked them, can we find anyone like this man, one in whom is the Spirit of God? Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, since God has made all this known to you, there is no one so discerning and wise as you. You shall be in charge of my palace, and all my people are to submit to your orders. Only with respect to the throne will I be greater than you. That's pretty significant, right? Like his story just took another turn for the better. And so this is what happens at the rest of Joseph's story. He becomes a prime minister of Egypt. Eventually, what he predicted in the dream, the interpretation happens. They have 7 years of prosperity, but because Joseph's there, because he knows what to do, they store up everything in these storehouses so that when the famine comes, they'll have enough to ration off to all the people in Egypt and the surrounding regions. And so that happens. And his brothers, who are not from Egypt, they're from a different region, are affected by the famine. And so their father says, go to Egypt and go get some grain so that we can make bread and so we don't starve. And so that's what they do. They go and they're affected by the famine, so they come up to Egypt, and who do they see but their brother Joseph? Except they don't know who he is. They don't recognize him because it's been years and years since they sold him into slavery. He was a young boy then, and now he's a young man, and he's dressed like an Egyptian, so they don't even know it's him. But Joseph chooses to reveal himself to his brothers, and they're terrified. Now, if there was any perfect time in Joseph's story to get revenge, to give his brothers what they deserved, to maybe just give them a little bit of payback, it's right now. He could easily send them away without grain, which would mean that they starve. He could easily throw them into prison. He's the prime minister of Egypt. He has authority to do that. Or he could just have them killed on the spot. Their lives are in his hand and they know it. And so he comes to another moment where he has to make a decision. What is he going to do? Well, ultimately, he decides to offer mercy and forgiveness and to reconcile the relationship with his brothers. And because of that, he gets to reconcile with his father, who previously thought he was dead. He gets to connect with a brother he never knew he had, and his whole family gets to come with him to live in Egypt. All because he chose to do the right thing. All because he chose to ask himself the right questions. Now, you might be asking yourself, why did Joseph do that? Why did he make that decision? Why didn't he choose to get revenge? Wouldn't it make sense that they get what they were given? That they get a little bit of what they had done to Joseph? And the reason is this. The reason is Joseph asked himself the legacy question. He asked himself, what story do I want to tell? And he asked that at every critical moment in his story, and he made good decisions. And his story is one that we use as an example because he decided to ask himself good questions. Now, I have a challenge for you. In your life, you're going to be faced with key moments where you need to ask yourself the legacy question. What story do you want to tell? And so I just want to challenge you, like we did last week with the integrity question, take some time this week, especially when you're facing a decision, and ask yourself, what story do you want to tell? And remember, you tell your story one decision at a time. What story do you want to tell? When you're long gone from this life, what story do you want other people to tell about you? And know that we make our stories. We create our stories. One decision and one response at a time. And so that's why it's so important for us to ask ourselves good decisions, to ask ourselves good questions, so we can make good decisions and ultimately have fewer regrets. Let's pray. God, I just want to thank you for stories like Joseph's, for the reminder that there is a way to make good decisions, and there is a way that we can tell good stories. And God, ultimately, we want our stories to point to you. We all know that we're telling the story of our lives one day at a time, one decision at a time. And so we pray that with everything that we do, we can make good decisions that point people to your love and your hope and your son, Jesus. And God, I just pray that you remember that the greatest legacy that we can live out is one that points to you. So I pray that in all that we do, that we would look to live our lives in a way that points people to you. It's in your name we pray. Amen.